It is early morning, in the cold and damp fields over northern France on October 25th, 1415. A steady rain had fallen through the night, turning the freshly ploughed fields near the village of Agincourt into thick, clinging mud. Across that sodden ground, two armies faced one another. The English, weary and hungry after weeks of marching, and the French, proud and confident, outnumbering their enemy perhaps 3-1. At the head of the English host stood King Henry V, 29 years old, his face marked by an old scar from the Battle of Shrewsbury 12 years prior. He had invaded France that summer, besieging and capturing the port of Harfleur in Normandy. But disease and exhaustion had ravaged his army. Dysentery alone had claimed hundreds. With winter approaching, Henry resolved to march his reduced force north toward the English-held port of Calais, hoping to reach safety and demonstrate English strength deep in enemy territory. The French army, fresh and overly confident, had pursued the English, blocking their path towards the port. Henry was now either forced to surrender or give battle. He chose the latter option. The two forces met at the fields of Agincourt. By the morning of Agincourt, Henry commanded around 6,000 men, perhaps 5,000 longbowmen and 1,000 men-at-arms. Many were veterans, disciplined and hardened by weeks of hardship. They carried longbows nearly 6 feet in height, capable of sending arrows more than 250 yards, each a yard-long shaft tipped with iron. Opposing the English were perhaps 20,000 French troops, the flower of French nobility. Heavy cavalry, glittering men-at-arms, and armored knights filled the muddy fields, confident that they would crush the outnumbered invaders. French commanders included Constable Charles d'Albret, Duke John I of Alençon, and Jean Le Mangre, Boucicaut, among others. Their ranks teemed with nobles eager for glory, ransom, and revenge for years of English raids on their homeland. The battlefield lay between two small patches of woodland, Tramecourt and Agincourt, forming a natural bottleneck that compressed the French advantage in numbers. Henry saw the terrain's potential. He placed his men in a single long line, men-at-arms in the center, flanked on both sides by ranks of longbowmen who drove sharpened wooden stakes into the ground to deter French heavy cavalry charges. The French, in contrast, were certain that their numerical advantage, especially their heavy cavalry, would seal them a decisive and swift victory. Therefore, they placed no importance on strategy. As dawn broke, the English knelt and kissed the muddy earth. Henry rode along the line, helmet on, his surcoat bearing the arms of England and France. He spoke to his men in both English and French, encouraging them to stand firm and be brave. Hours passed as both sides waited, each reluctant to move first. The French expected Henry to attack, but he would not. Henry came to the realization that the French had ample supplies and food, and could simply wait for the English to starve. Henry's hand was forced. He could not wait for his men to begin deserting, so at last he gave the order to advance his line forward, shortening the distance to the enemy and forcing battle. When the English halted, the longbowmen planted their stakes once more. Then the order rang out, "Loose!" A storm of arrows darkened the sky. The longbowmen loosed again and again, 5 or 6 arrows a minute, their shafts whistling through the air, falling among the French front ranks. Horses screamed, knights fell, and the ordered lines began to falter. The French cavalry vanguard advanced through the mud, weighed down by plate armor that soon grew heavy with clinging clay. Horses stumbled and fell, flinging riders to the ground.
Here they come! Fire, you idiots! Move! Move!
As the French heavy-mounted knights rode through the dense mud, Horses stumbled and fell, flinging riders to the ground. Still, the arrows came pouring down. When the French cavalry finally reached the English line, the horses were exhausted, and their formation was disordered. The English longbowmen, protected by their wooden stakes, continued to fire thousands of arrows, cutting down the French cavalry in droves. As the knights rode around looking for a way through the chaos, many of the horses slipped and crushed men beneath them. The longbowmen continued to rain death upon the French cavalry until they ultimately grabbed the reins of their horses, turned in the other direction, and rode off as swiftly as they could. With the collapse of their heavy cavalry, the French commander sent forth contingents of men-at-arms and heavy infantry. The march towards the English position was a few hundred yards in watered-down mud and clay, combined with wearing heavy armor, as well as carrying heavy weaponry, such as two-handed poleaxes, axes, maces, and two-handed swords, slowed down the French infantry considerably. Although the French infantry were well armored, many historians debate the effectiveness of the longbows from a distance, with most in agreement that the longbow could penetrate the thinner armor on the limbs even at 220 yards, as well as the eye and air holes in their helmets, which were among the weakest points in the armor. With tens of thousands of arrows being fired every minute, many hit their mark and were lethal. The surviving French men-at-arms and heavy infantry reached the front of the English lines, and with sheer momentum and numbers pushed back Henry's heavy men-at-arms. The longbowmen on the flanks continued to loose projectiles. The French were now at point-blank range, and the English arrows proved to be significantly deadlier. Thousands of heavy French infantry continued pouring forward, hoping to overwhelm Henry's infantry. The French had an advantage of at least 10-1. They were tired and disorganized from their exhausting march through the mud, which in turn slowed them from overwhelming the much smaller English force. English men-at-arms, fighting on foot, met them with poleaxes, swords, and hammers. Though it rapidly became obvious that trying to contain the sheer mass of French infantry became pointless, King Henry, at the forefront of the melee battle alongside his men-at-arms, slowly gave ground and edged back towards the lines of his longbowmen. Many of the English longbowmen, having fired all their arrows, threw aside their bows and joined the melee with mallets, hatchets, and swords. It was at this stage where the English sprung their ingenious strategical maneuver. The longbowmen on both wings of Henry's army, still equipped with arrows, surrounded the flanks of the French and loosed projectiles at point-blank range straight into the vulnerable sides of their heavy infantry, dealing significant damage. Once they had emptied their arrow caches, they too dropped their bows and charged headfirst into the fighting. Their swift movements, coupled with their positioning, allowed them to flank the French, in turn catching them in an envelopment. With this brilliant maneuver, the tide of the battle shifted in favor of Henry and his English troops. Those in the French ranks were utterly dumbfounded with what had just occurred. How, with such a supreme advantage, were they now the ones who were surrounded on all sides and on the cusp of defeat? The melee was brutal and claustrophobic. The narrow field forced the French to crowd together shoulder to shoulder. At a certain point, it became so bad that they could barely swing their swords or maces effectively. Many French knights slipped and fell, trampled by their own men as the second and third waves pushed forward from behind. The mud, thick from rain and churned by thousands of feet, swallowed men whole. Henry himself fought in the thick of the fray. At one point, a French knight, the Duke of Alençon, broke through and struck the king's crown, denting it. Henry's bodyguards cut the Duke down, and the king fought on, rallying his men. By late morning, the French assault had collapsed. Thousands lay dead or wounded. Many French infantry with still a viable passage to flee took the opportunity. Many of the great French nobles were slain. The Constable Charles d'Albret, the Dukes of Alençon and Brabant, and countless knights and squires. English longbowmen swarmed over the wounded, taking prisoners or finishing them. When a sudden false alarm spread that French troops were attacking the English rear, a false rumor sparked by a raid on the English baggage train, Henry, fearing they might rearm and join the fight, knew that his exhausted men could not withstand another attack. He made the grim decision to kill all the prisoners. The English troops, grim-faced, obeyed. Hundreds of captives, many of them high-born, were slain before the threat proved false. It was one of the most controversial moments of the battle. The remainder of the French army, completely demoralized at what they had just witnessed, opted to retreat and live to fight another day. French casualties numbered around 6,000 to 10,000, while English losses were perhaps 600, depending on the sources you read. The victory at Agincourt was astonishing. Henry's tiny, exhausted army had annihilated a far larger host through discipline, terrain, and the deadly power of the longbow. The battle cemented Henry's reputation as one of England's greatest warrior kings.